Duncan Weldon, thank you very much for being a guest today.
Thank you for having me.
So I'm going to begin with my Inside the Actor Studio questionnaire. What is your favourite word?
That's actually a really tough question. You gave me about 30 seconds warning before we started. I'm going to go with serendipity. Not because I particularly love the word, but because I love how it sounds and how it feels on my mouth.
It's very onomatopoeic.
Exactly, exactly.
What is your least favourite word?
Least favourite word. It's going to be some long compound German term that you come across in military history. In fact, no, I'm changing my mind. My least favourite words, and I'm not going to try and say them, are the Dutch name for the Dutch East India Company because I made the mistake of putting that in my book when I was going to do the audio narration, and that was 6 takes. So, apologies to any Dutch listeners, but no.
I mean, I was about to say, I've been listening to an audio book of a recent biography of Metternich,
Mhm.
and it's by a German author, and it has some amazingly long German words in it.
Yes,
Uh,
yes.
there was a particular one, and the guy who read the book, full props to him. The pronunciation was excellent, and it was talking about how basically Napoleon was a bit of a parvenu, um,
Yes.
and he Metternich felt Napoleon didn't have. It was great.
Yeah.
What is your favorite swear word?
My favourite swear word, I'm really basic. The one I probably use the most is piss. Is that even a swear word? I think that might be a swear word. I would tell my children it's a swear word.
uh, so I don't know how this is going to fit in, but has any recent economic news caused you to use it?
I not that one, but the announcements coming out of the White House since January have caused no end of swearing in the Weldon household.
What is a sound or noise that you love?
What is the what noise I love?
A sound or noise.
A sound or noise. There is a very special place in my heart for the sound of a TIE fighter going past from Star Wars, which is also how Ash opened their album 1977, which I've been listening to a lot recently.
I'm guessing you've seen Andor.
I have seen Andor. I very much enjoyed it. Probably the best new Star Wars in quite a long time.
Well, since season one.
Very possibly.
What is a sound or noise that you hate?
A sound or noise that I hate. Car horns. Car horns. People don't understand what car horns are for. Car horns are for signalling that there's about to be a hazard or that someone is, or that someone's in your way. They're not for just randomly hitting when you're stuck in traffic.
Uh, do you have any guilty pleasures?
Guilty pleasures. I'm going to try and make it through the next hour without vaping.
uh, what is your favorite book?
Oh, now that is a very, very good question. It varies over time. Probably the book I always recommend when people ask for a book recommendation is a book called Vermeer's Hat by a historian called Timothy Brooke, which is just a wonderful book in which he uses 10 or 12 Vermeer paintings from sort of the Dutch Golden Age and uses each one as a window to tell a story about early modern globalization. So, there is a beaver skin pelt in the background, and that's a chance to talk about the beaver pelt trade in North America. Fantastic.
Finally, are there any fictional characters who you'd like to imagine yourself to be?
I'm a big fan of the Patrick O'Brien sort of Napoleonic naval novels, and yes, I would quite like to be Stephen Maturin, but I'm neither, half Irish, half Catalan, nor a spy, nor do I speak a half dozen languages, nor am I a surgeon.
So I thought I'd begin by asking, what drew you to wanting to look at the relationship between war and economics?
Yeah, so I think it's really important, and I think what drew me to it was, I mean, they're both topics I've been interested in for a long time. I spent most of my career working in and around economics. I've always been interested in history. That led me to economic history. But I've always been interested in sort of military history as well. And I think actually, sort of the linkages between economics and warfare, how warfare has driven economic change, how economics have impacted on warfare and state power over the long run. or just a fascinating subject. And this was actually a really fun book to research. I'm not going to say it was a fun book to write, because no book is actually fun to write. Researching a book is fun. Having written a book is fun. The bit in between is not fun. But I could spend time learning about the economics of the Mongol Empire, and then I could be learning about sort of early modern Spain's state structures. So it was a really fun project to work on.
Something you stress over and over in the book is the importance of institutions and incentives. And so I was curious if that was a theory you had before you started the book, or did it come out of the research?
I think I went in with the theory. So, I mean, take them separately. So, incentives, really quickly, are just core to economic thinking. Try and work out what people's incentives are, and how that's just how you're sort of taught to think when you learn economics. Institutions is a more interesting one. So, the fundamental, really big question in economics is, why are some countries rich and some countries poor? I was born in Britain, and that's the most important thing that's ever happened to my life chances. There are many, many other countries I could have been born in where I wouldn't have the same standard of living. It's that lottery of life, and you win it if you're born in a developed country. And trying to work out why some countries are comparatively rich and some are comparatively poor is, I think, the fundamental big question. And the best evidence that we have is that it's not technology, it's not climate, it's not weather patterns. All of these sorts of things, they can all play a role, but it's some countries have developed institutions which support economic growth and prosperity, and some haven't. And if you think institutions are important, the most important institution in the long history of humanity is the state, and nothing has shaped states more than warfare and preparing for war. Until the 19th century, fighting wars and preparing for wars was primarily what states did. So I think that history of warfare gets you into the history of the state. The history of the state gets you into thinking about institutions, and institutions are key to understanding the world we live in today.
I mean, an interesting uh, thing you did in the book was sort of everyone sort of posits the dichotomy of like Europe and China, and Europe had a lot of war, China didn't really have any war, and then you sort of put forward the example of India, which also had a lot of war, but also didn't have the same state development like Europe.
Yeah, so India's sort of the missing third man in this debate quite often. So, I mean, particularly since the late 1990s, economic historians got, obsessed with this idea of, they call it the Great Divergence. Why is China overtaken by Europe, and in particular Western Europe? And yeah, the most common argument is this argument about warfare, that China is generally one, sometimes two or three, but more usually one dominant state. Europe, partially because of natural mountain ranges and rivers providing all these different borders, is usually more of a patchwork quilt of states. There's a lot more competition between these states. There's a lot of fighting in Europe in a way there isn't in China. And yes, the argument has been that it's this competition between states, which for all sorts of reasons and different mechanisms drives economic growth and living standards higher in Europe. But yeah, India is an interesting one because it's another quite densely populated area. It's made up of, much like Europe, a patchwork of different states which are fighting each other. And it is interesting. There's a study which is like the most economic historian thing in the world. There's a study which I love, which I talk about in the book, where a team of economic historians, and this really is something only a team of economic historians would ever consider doing, sort of get the records, as many records as they can, of battles fought in the Indian subcontinent back to, I think it's 1000 AD, sort of geolocated them. So you've got sort of hundreds of years of battle data geolocated onto a map of modern India. And then they get satellite photos taken between the 1990s and 2010. And each pixel on the satellite photo is roughly 1 square kilometre. They look at these satellite photos every evening to see how much light there is in each one, because, the number of lights on an area is not a bad proxy for economic development. You put the two together, And what you see is areas where there were lots of fighting over the last 1,000 years nowadays have more light visible in the night sky and are more economically developed. And that link, which people posit in Europe, seems to be present in the Indian data too.
One of the things I loved about the book was you sort of overturning accepted narratives, like on the head. Um, and when the US UK trade deal was announced early in May, Alan Beattie, the trade expert at the FT, wrote a piece criticizing it, and he called it a modern example of the Danegeld,
Yeah,
when the English basically paid the Vikings not to attack them.
yeah.
And at the time, I just started reading your book, and I badly wanted to reply to him on Blue Sky saying the Danegeld was actually a good thing.
Yeah, so it's interesting, isn't it? So, yeah, so the Viking Age, the English and also the Franks in what's now France quite regularly take to basically paying extortion payments to the Vikings. Fighting the Vikings is one thing, giving them a big lump of silver to go away for a bit is another. And yeah, sort of the Danegeld's got a really bad historic reputation, bad enough that Kipling wrote a poem about it, saying paying the Danegeld is a bad thing. But as I put in the book, the advice to never give in to a bully is quite easy to give when you are not yourself being bullied. What's interesting about the Danegeld, though, I think, is in economic terms, it's fiscal transfer. You're handing over some money from one state to another. Sort of the second question, is what happens to that money? The Vikings aren't sort of pirates in a children's story. You bury it somewhere, put a big X on a map. They generally spend it, and they're generally spending it on goods and services, often from the people who paid it in the first place. So what you see in sort of the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries, the Viking Age, is actually quite a big pickup in production, in trade, in exchange around the North Sea world, perhaps sort of greased and oiled by those Danegeld payments.
What were your favourite finds in the research?
So I enjoyed doing the Vikings very much. The Vikings, it's partially the story of the economics of the tribute payments, extortion payments, and it's partially about this idea of stationary versus roving bandits. And the argument that no one wants to be robbed by a bandit. The ideal type of bandit to encounter is no bandit. But if you are going to encounter a bandit, a stationary bandit is much better than a roving one, because a roving bandit, their incentives are grab as much as they can carry, do as much damage as they need to do that, and bugger off. Whereas a stationary bandit who's moved into an area, it looks far more like a mafia protection thing, where you just the stationary bandit doesn't want to kill the goose that's laying the golden eggs, so they provide some protection in return for sort of regular extortion payments. I enjoyed that. I was very interested in all of the sort of 20th century sort of total war stuff, which I'd done bits of before. But I think if I had to pick a single favourite, I enjoyed the chapter on the Italian Renaissance and why outsourcing all of your security needs to mercenaries might be a bad idea, and why there might be some upsides of this as well.
I mean, I've always kind of been fascinated by the condottieri, but it was the first time I'd seen sort of the economics behind it.
Yeah, so I'll talk about that because it's fun. So sort of medieval Italy. So I go into this with the quote from Harry Lime in the film The Third Man. Tremendous film. Harry Lime, sort of the villain of that, he's got this wonderful line, which I will get slightly wrong because I don't know the book in front of you, but you'll get the idea. It's something like Switzerland, 500 years of brotherly love, what they invent the cuckoo clock. Renaissance Italy, the Borgias, hundreds of years of warfare. You get Leonardo, you get all of these amazing bits of art. And so that question is, I think, interesting because medieval Italy and early modern Italy does have an awful lot of warfare. And Italy looks quite different at this point from the rest of Europe. It's this patchwork of very small states, none of them dominant, from sort of Duchy of Milan, the Venetian Republic, Papal States, Kingdom of Naples, various independent city-states. It's very, very urbanized compared to the rest of Europe. It's quite rich compared to the rest of Europe. And all of these states are trying to maintain their balance of power with each other. So they're fighting this almost constant set of wars, small states versus small states. But in Italy, unlike in the rest of Europe, they generally hire professionals to do it. These so-called condottieri, from the Italian word for a contract, who, sort of small to large bands of soldiers, initially mainly foreigners, by the end Italian. All of these states are hiring these mercenaries. The thing is, though, these mercenaries have no loyalty to any particular state. They might be fighting for Venice 1 year, they might be signed on with Florence a couple of years later, might move down and work for Naples after that. And they've got no real incentive to try that hard. So you get all of these descriptions of sort of condottieri warfare where, the captains will say they've studied the classical texts and they've looked at how the Romans fought wars and how the Greeks fought wars, and actually it's all about manoeuvre. But they're very good at manoeuvring to not actually come into contact with each other, because so what you get is this sort of world where Machiavelli sort of describes it as, the only people that win are the condottieri, who are being paid a fortune. It doesn't matter whether the state wins or loses, it's handing over a lot of money to these sort of so-called professionals. The incentives of these professionals are quite poorly aligned with the state paying them. So sort of the avoidance of battle becomes more important than that.
I mean, it kind of reminds me of the whole stationary versus roving bandits, because a book I really like is John Julius Norwich's book about the Kingdom of Sicily.
Yes, I've only read his Venice, actually. I haven't read his
So basically, that begins with the Normans starting as almost like condottieri, and then basically transitioning from roving bandits to stationary bandits.
Yeah, I think it's a story of a lot of sort of medieval state building. That these people start off as often roving bandits, they become stationary bandits, and over time, stationary bandits start to look increasingly like something we would recognise as states. They're extorting money, which eventually becomes taxation, and they're providing some sort of public goods in return. But yeah, and you see these all sort of developing around Europe.
Another early modern one I liked was basically how the discovery of America was a economic disaster for Spain.
Yes, and it's fascinating. So if you go to 1492, when Columbus arrives in the what we call the New World, Spain, because of a dynastic accident, the Habsburg lands have been brought together in the the person of Charles V, Charles the Great. He's ruling Spain. He's ruling the Netherlands. He's also Holy Roman Emperor of sort of the German lands and bits of Central Europe. He's controlling bits of the Italian peninsula. It's a very, very wide collection of European states. And Southern Europe is at this point the richest part of Europe. It's Italy, it's Spain, Southern France. Basically, the bits around the Mediterranean, which have been the richest bit of Europe for a very, very long time, dating back to Roman days. The Mediterranean at the centre of that trading network. And then you've also got this guy controlling this very large conglomeration of territory, including the richest bits of Europe. And then you hand over to the Habsburgs access, control of large parts of this new world, which is, filled with valuable cash crops, and in particular filled with silver. And you get all of this outflow of South American silver into Spain. And it should look like this is going to sort of cement Southern European economic predominance in the continent. But it does quite the opposite. Spain, in the long run, becomes a poorer country. Philip II becomes known as the debtor from hell, constantly defaulting on his debts. And I think it really takes you into this interesting question of sort of the political economy of early modern Spain and how institutions develop. So generally, even when most of Europe is ruled by monarchs or kings, they're very rarely, absolute rulers. There's always a bargaining process. You've got to deal with powerful nobles or vassals or the commercial elite, all of this sort of stuff. And generally, when monarchs want money, they have to summon Parliament, and there are plenty of examples of, say, English parliaments stopping Henry VIII from fighting wars. He says, I want money for a war in France, and Parliament meets and says, we're not granting it this time. the Habsburgs amongst them, because they've got access to this flow of silver, which is directly controlled by them rather than any of their subsidiary territories. They've got this sort of tap of money coming directly to them, so they can summon fewer and fewer parliaments. Actually, the amount of Spanish parliaments, Aragonese parliaments, Castilian parliaments, separate, actually fall over time. And you don't get that institutional development which you see in the young Dutch Republic, which you see in England, which then becomes Great Britain. And ultimately, the discovery of the New World, also the circumnavigating of the Cape, that route to the Indian Ocean. It might be Vasco da Gama and Christopher Columbus. It might be Spain and Portugal, which initially seem in the lead. But this reshaping of the world economy, the ultimate beneficiaries are England and then Britain and the Dutch Republic. Europe's centre of economic gravity moves from the Mediterranean to the North Sea, despite the Spanish having initially been in the lead. And this is a story of institutional structures and how they change economies in the medium term.
Something that's always fascinated me is I think one historian called it like the bureaucratic entrepreneurialism of the First and Second World Wars. Last summer, I talked to Damien Collins about his book about David Lloyd George and his sort of bureaucratic innovations like the Ministry of Munitions, the War Cabinet. So something else I loved about the book is that chapter on how Britain organized itself economically for total war compared to the Germans.
Yeah, and I think, in the book, and quite often, the First and Second World Wars get run together as this sort of, argument about total war management. The policymakers in the Second World War had an easier job of it because they had the example of the First World War, how it worked. And, I think Britain in the First World War is a fascinating case. When Britain goes to war in 1914, there's lots of assumptions. One of those assumptions is this will all be over relatively quickly. The war will last 6, 7, 8, 9 months, probably over by Christmas. And that, in some ways, isn't an unreasonable assumption. The great power wars in Europe in the latter half of the 19th century have generally been quite brief affairs. But it's not just that the war will be over quickly. So the role Britain will play in the war isn't fully understood either. Lots of people think Britain is going to fight a war which looks like Britain's role in the Napoleonic Wars, or 7 Years' War, the War of Spanish Succession. Britain is going to be using its naval power to blockade Germany, and it's going to be serving as sort of the paymaster of the Entente powers, providing, munitions and money as needed. But Britain isn't going to be involved in a major land war on the continent. The expeditionary force that goes to France is 6 divisions. By 1916, 1917, Britain's got 70 divisions on the continent. It's been drawn into a major land war. And, economic management of this war has to change. So, Britain at first thinks it's going to fight, business as usual. That we're going to try and disrupt civilian life as little as possible. We're going to try and disrupt the export industries as little as possible because Britain needs to be a functioning trading country, to be earning this money, to be functioning as the paymaster of the Allies. It becomes apparent very quickly they're in a very, very different kind of war. A war which has this thirst for huge numbers of fresh soldiers every month. A war which has an even greater thirst for colossal amounts of munitions and in particular artillery shells, and just trading off. Okay, we need enough men to be actually fighting in the army and enough people to be in the factories making the munitions is hard enough. But that's not all you're trading off. You've also got to ensure your civilian economy stays afloat so you don't get sort of support for the war falling, or in the worst case, the Russian example, an utter collapse of the regime. And I think you're fundamentally getting to these economic questions of trade-offs and resource allocation. And yes, Lloyd George was a great innovator in terms of building a new machinery of government around this. The Ministry of Munitions, by the end of the war, was employing about 2.5 million people and was almost certainly the largest industrial organisation anywhere in the world, sort of built from scratch at a time of conflict. And Much easier in the Second World War when you form the Ministry of Supply, and they can go and read the actual published official history of the Ministry of Munitions as sort of a practical how-to guide to how you organise a war economy.
I mean, for years I've always loved David Grigg's book about Lloyd George, especially the War Leader volume, and I think that opens with like how Lloyd George's position in December 1916-17 was arguably worse than Churchill's in 1940,
Yeah,
because there was no intellectual framework for dealing with a total war,
yeah,
and even just something like say a convoy system for the merchant fleet was like incredibly controversial to the navy, and it took months to
yeah.
persuade the navy to actually do a convoy system, whereas all this thinking was just a hand for leaders in the Second World War.
Yeah, it's like the convoy debate. Again, absolutely fascinating. And it's very easy in hindsight to look back and say, well, they obviously, if the Germans have launched unrestricted submarine warfare, they obviously need to group the merchant ships into convoys where they can provide some naval protection. But it's not obvious at the time. I mean, just like one really basic level, if you move from a system where ships are generally moving individually to they're moving in convoys, then unloading them becomes a lot harder. Because rather than one ship at a time arriving in port, there's a whole, gaggle of them, and it's not. None of these things are as straightforward as they appear in hindsight, and I think they are easier in the Second World War when we've got sort of the evidence, the very recent evidence, 25 years before, whatever, of these are the things which worked last time.
So over the last several months, there's been a lot of commentary and political activity about European rearmament, and in the book, talking about how the sort of US dollar established itself through a process, but it took sort of the Civil War to really embed it. You say that with Europeans looking for a similar moment, a Hamiltonian moment, the challenge is to do it without bloodshed and sort of vicious fighting. But something I've wondered is if the EU has been going through a similar sort of process of consolidation over, say, the last 20 years, and Ukraine is the accelerant.
Yeah, so I think the European Union, and well, step back from the European Union, just look at the Eurozone itself, sort of, the core, sort of, more economically unified, sharing the common currency. It has generally responded. I think the European Union and the Eurozone in terms of its institutional structure over the last 20, 25 years have basically had two modes. It's had non-crisis times when everything moves very, very slowly and there's much foot dragging and national interests tend to be put to the fore. And then there are crisis moments when it's been able to move really quickly. And eventually it got on top of the European sovereign debt crisis in 2012. It actually handled the pandemic very well and the economic aspects of that. You saw much more progress in terms of a strong fiscal and budgetary response than had seemed possible before the pandemic hit. And it may be that the combination of two things, the recognition that Russia provides a real and possibly pressing security threat, coupled with the outcome of the presidential election in the United States and the fact that NATO's Article 5 is not necessarily a sort of cast iron guarantee in the way it was, that this creates the crisis atmosphere which allows for big steps forward. And we can see that in Germany. The decision to tear up the old fiscal rules, the black zero, targeting debt reduction in the long run, and say over the next 5-6 years we're going to borrow €1 trillion, half of that defence, half of that for infrastructure. That wouldn't have happened without the war in Ukraine, and I don't think it would have happened without the results of the US presidential election. I think that's a really big step forward in terms of Europe changing. But there's a lot more to go in terms of European rearmament. But the early steps all seem to be in the right direction, with most European countries moving in lockstep on this too.
For most of the book, it seems like a lot of the the institutions and the incentives are accidental rather than sort of specifically designed to have an economic impact. In order to sort of finance and sustain European rearmament, there's been a lot of sort of bureaucratic entrepreneurialism going on. A lot of various schemes about rearmament banks, loan guarantees, etc. I'm sort of curious about what's your view on the institutions and incentives that Europe seem to be trying to put together.
Yeah, so I mean, it's true. Like a lot of sort of the institutional innovation is, if not accidental, then at least ends up, looking very different to a classic one is the Bank of England. The Bank of England is formed in the 1690s specifically to help finance rebuilding of the English and then British fleet. Its core purpose is to raise money for the war against France. And obviously, 3 centuries down the road, the Bank of England is less concerned with raising money for a war against France and has sort of developed into, a modern central bank. But most modern central banks started out as these sort of war-fighting tools. Things change. Right now, there's a lot of institutional energy and political capital in Europe going into sort of structures and bureaucratic processes, working out, yes, setting up sort of, rearmament banks and loan funds and all of this. It all helps, but I think that's partially because this is what the institutions of the European Union can do. The institutions of the European Union can't be buying shells, and they can't be buying tanks, and they can't be ordering modern combat aircraft or drones. That relies on the member states actually doing it. So what we see at sort of the cross-European level is the Commission doing what the Commission can do, which is designing structures to support all of this. It's going to be down to the actual individual member states and also non-member states like Britain and Norway to increase their own defence spending and hopefully coordinate it across Europe. I mean, the incentives become very interesting, though. The Economist published a really straightforward and very simple, but wonderfully effective chart a few months ago, where they plotted European defence spending versus distance of the capital from Moscow. And it's almost a straight line. The closer you are to Moscow, the higher you spend as a percentage of your defence, percentage of your economy on defence. Eastern Europeans generally high, Spain and Portugal quite low. And that's sort of the incentive pattern which Europe has to get around. The Spanish have said they're going to increase defence spending as a share of GDP to 2%, the old NATO, the current NATO target, which expects to be moved up quite soon, getting countries like Spain, Portugal, Italy to increase defence spending because they don't face the same incentives to do it. That's going to be the real political challenge, I think, in the months ahead.
The Labour MP Jeevan Sander wrote a really interesting article the other day about Britain preparing for total war with Russia. And he sort of argues that in the event of total war, Britain needs to both rapidly scale up production of munitions and weapons platforms and also rapidly reallocate labour to defence production. But something that really interested me in the book was how in the World Wars, as you alluded to, Britain had to maintain a balance between military necessities and also wider economic concerns. And that was what ultimately gave Britain the edge. And I'm kind of curious about, in the event of total war, what would that look like today versus the mass industrial economy of the mid 20th century?
So to start off, it's a fascinating question, which I don't really know the full answer to. So, how important is having a large and diverse manufacturing base to modern warfare? So, I mean, obviously, in the 20th century, in the First and Second World Wars, having a large manufacturing base which could be rapidly retooled into making munitions or armoured vehicles or rifles or whatever the kit was that was needed was very, very important. Now, until recently, there was sort of a long vein of argument, I think, that modern manufacturing in the 2020s looks very different to manufacturing even in the 1960s or 1970s, let alone the 1940s or 1910s. It's a much more specialized process, and it's much harder to switch it to direct sort of war material. Um, which I have some sympathy with, although it has been interesting this year that we've seen in Germany, where the German automotive sector has had a really, really tough 2 or 3 years, losing market share globally to Chinese volume makers. We are seeing, talk of companies like Rheinmetall, the big German arms company, taking over facilities which used to be part of Continental, the German auto parts company, and being retooled. So it may be that actually that sort of interoperability is still there. With the investment, you can retool civilian-focused manufacturing to defence, and obviously there will be lots of skills in common across the workforce that may still be there. I find it fascinating how much the debate's changed. So when the decision was made to nationalise or semi-nationalise or keep open the Scunthorpe steel mill, the Labour government gave the argument that it's important for it to maintain domestic steel production technology as a capacity, like every other G7 country, for national security reasons. Now, the argument we should maintain steel production for national security reasons has been made every time a steel mill has closed in Britain for the last 20-25 years. This time it doesn't sound ridiculous. We are in a world where you do need to start thinking about, okay, what would a war, a total war, look like? Would we need our own steel manufacturing capacity? And the answer is probably yes. I think that's. So I'm going to say two things. A rambling answer. I think firstly, we shouldn't underestimate the extent to which modern liberal capitalist economies are very, very flexible. And if you put the incentives in place, they can switch production very quickly. I think you saw that in terms of the vaccine rollout and the availability of personal protective equipment during the pandemic. Things rapidly were retooled. And after a short-term imbalance, the supply stood up to the demand. They can move quickly when they have to. What you're really looking at, I think, is resilience. So things like maintaining some steel capacity is useful. Although we shouldn't mistake resilience for self-sufficiency. Britain in both world wars continued to import lots of things, including most of its food in both wars. And British policymakers saw this as a strength. They were like, the fact we can buy our food from all over the world, from Australasia, from Asia, from South America, from South Africa, means we don't need as many British people to be working in the fields producing food, so they can instead be working in factories producing arms or in uniform serving in the armed forces. Germany in neither World War had that. A substantial portion of the German workforce were tied up working in the field. So resilience and self-sufficiency aren't the same thing.
I remember this whole debate, I think it was on Blue Sky, about food security, and a lot of people assuming that food security meant growing it ourselves and not a sort of wider logistical operation.
Yeah, I think that's completely it. The numbers in the First World War are pretty staggering. Britain is a country which imports more than half of its calories, and no deaths from starvation during the Great War. Germany is a country which imports only 25% of its calories, and maybe 700,000 deaths from famine and malnutrition over the war. As long as you can keep those sea lanes open, as long as you've got that security of supply from somewhere, it doesn't matter whether you're growing it domestically or importing it from the River Plate.
Finally, I was just going to end on sort of core to Labour's mission as a government, and also its re-election strategy, is growth. And there seems to be a lot of effort and not necessarily too much growth. So I'm curious about your view on Labour's strategy, and is it going to work?
Yeah, so I'll start off by saying, I think people have got, including me, if you consider possible, I think people have got a bit too gloomy about where the British economy is at the moment. Every month the Treasury publishes a sort of a monthly roundup of independent forecasts for the British economy. And if you look back at sort of forecasts for the year 2025, we're now in sort of 7-8 months of downward revisions. So every month everybody's a bit pessimistic about 2025. Whereas actually, I think we've probably hit bottom on that. Petrol is, because of global factors, because OPEC is dumping more, petrol is the cheapest in real terms it's been for 20 years. Interest rates have fallen. People refixing their mortgages have more money in their pocket. All of these Chinese goods which can no longer get into the United States for trade war. It's going to be lower consumer prices for lots of goods. I think you start to tell a story where the British economy is through the worst, and things will start to pick up from about now and throughout the year. But that's just the 1 year. I think the problem the government have had at their budget last autumn was there was an awful lot of tax rises, about 30-35 billion pounds of tax rises. It's probably the second biggest tax raising budget since the early 90s. Black Wednesday. And there was also an awful lot more government spending. There was a really big increase in current government spending on public services and a particularly big increase in capital spending. But sort of the economics of this is sort of the pain of the tax rises was almost instant. Lots of them came into effect this April. The budget was only in October. So we had sort of November to March of people anticipating tax rises and reacting, then actually experiencing the tax rises. So all of sort of the economic pain from that budget was front-loaded and has now hit. Whereas sort of the more growth-enhancing stuff, particularly increased capital spending, you don't start to feel the benefits of until 2027 at the earliest, more like 2028 into 2029 and even longer. So I think the government is currently still in a world where people are feeling the pain in the budget without feeling some of the more growth-enhancing stuff. In the medium term, there's lots the government is putting in place that might start to increase growth. The free trade deals over the last few weeks, India, the United States, and the European Union. None of these things is a huge deal economically in and of themselves, but again, cumulatively over time, they all start to add. I think perfectly possible to imagine. The British economy is growing at a reasonable clip by 2028, 2029, around when the next election is, and I think too much of the commentary is sort of firmly rooted in where we are in 2025 rather than where we are likely to be in the years ahead.
A few weeks ago, I interviewed Adam Drummond from Opinium, and we were sort of talking about how the mess Labour seems to have gone into on the whole immigration sort of policy and sort of Starmer's speech and everything was, I guess, a kind of losing their nerve about growth coming in 27, 28, 29, worrying about the polls right now, and in terms of policies, potentially curbing economic growth medium to long term in the hope of getting a polling bounce now, which seems completely irrational.
It does, and I think the problem the government have had over the last few months is far too much focus on immediate polls and immediate public concerns, and sometimes you have to forget about fighting an election and just actually govern. And I think that there has been rather not enough of that. I mean, I think that is completely fair, and I mean, the immigration stuff is interesting because very, very, very tough language around it. Language looks more designed to appeal to sort of reform voters than Labour's own core vote. Language which might well push lots of people who tactically voted Labour at the last general election to vote Green or Lib Dem in the future. Very politically unhelpful. But the actual measures, when you step back from the language and the rhetoric, don't appear to have been anywhere near as tough as as was suggested. In the end, net migration fell very heavily in 2024. 2023, 2022, 2021 were exceptional years for numbers of reasons. And it looks very much like, even with no change, net migration will fall in the years ahead. And it looked like the government just wanting to say something very tough to almost claim credit for something that was going to happen anyway. Whether that was politically sensible or not is a different question. But I think the underlying changes, I think, are not as stringent as perhaps so.
Finally, I was just going to ask: are you working on anything new, or are you having a break from book writing?
The thing about writing a book is, I said before, the research bit is really, really good fun, and having written a book is a really, really nice feeling. The bit in between is not something I enjoy. I'm sure it's not something lots of people enjoy, and it's a bit like having children. I think that having a small baby in the house is very, very difficult. Having a slightly older child is nice, and you eventually forget about that bit with the small baby in the house. I think I will have another one that's quite nice. Then you go through it again. In my experience so far, writing books is like that. So ask me again in 6 or 12 months when I'm enjoying having written a book and I've forgotten what it's like to actually write one. And maybe that's about the time I will turn to another project.
Duncan Weldon, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.